A little girl slammed into Steven Seagal's chest, her tiny fists clutching his jacket as she screamed that men were beating her mama around the corner. Seagal didn't ask questions. He pushed through the crowd and moved straight toward the sounds of a woman screaming. What happened in the next 5 minutes would become neighborhood legend, a story whispered about for decades. The little girl hit Steven Seagal at a dead sprint, her tiny fists grabbing his jacket so hard the leather creased, and the tears on her face weren't the kind kids fake when they want candy. These were the real ones, the ones that come with snot and shaking and a voice that can barely get the words out. "They're beating my mama," she said, and her fingers wouldn't let go. "Please, they're beating my mama right now." What happened in the next 45 minutes would become one of those stories people in this neighborhood still talk about when Seagal's name comes up. Not a movie scene, not a choreographed fight, a real moment, raw and ugly, whispered about for decades by the people who were standing close enough to see it. But we gotta go back a little. It's a Saturday afternoon. Seagal's in the parking lot of a strip mall on the south side of Detroit. Not a fancy part of town. He's there doing community outreach, one of those events where a celebrity shows up, shakes hands, takes pictures, talks to local kids about staying off the streets. Now look, people have opinions about Steven Seagal. Some think he's the real deal. Some think he's all Hollywood smoke. But here's the thing nobody argues about. In 1990, this man was at the absolute peak of his fame. Hard to Kill had just torn through the box office. Above the Law before that, Marked for Death was about to drop. He wasn't just an action star. He was the action star who people genuinely believed could handle himself because, unlike most of the guys in that era, Seagal actually had the credentials. 7th Dan black belt in Aikido. First foreigner to operate a dojo in Japan. The man had trained with masters in Osaka for over a decade, so when he showed up in Detroit that Saturday, he wasn't there with bodyguards in suits and earpieces. He had a couple guys from the local precinct and a community organizer named Dwight who'd set the whole thing up. That was it. Casual. Believe me, nothing about that afternoon felt like it was heading toward anything crazy. Seagal was leaning against the hood of a black Suburban, signing autographs, talking to teenagers about discipline. One kid asked him to demonstrate a wrist lock. He did, gently, and everybody laughed when the kid tried to resist and ended up on his tiptoes going ow 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 with a grin on his face. Good vibes. Easy afternoon. Then the girl came running across the lot. She couldn't have been more than 7, maybe 8. Thin, dark braids with pink beads on the ends, one of them half undone. She wasn't running from something behind her. She was running toward something in front of her, toward him. And the way she moved, arms pumping, sneakers barely lacing the pavement, you could tell this wasn't a kid coming over for an autograph. This was a kid in crisis. She hit Seagal's midsection and grabbed on. Dwight stepped forward to pull her away. Seagal put a hand up, stopped him. Then he bent down, one knee on the asphalt, and he put his hands on her shoulders and he said, "Slow down. Slow down, tell me." His voice was calm, not the movie voice, not the whisper growl he does on screen. Just calm. Like a guy who understood that the first thing a scared kid needs is somebody who isn't scared, she told him. Her name was Keisha. She lived 3 blocks east, in a row of brick duplexes that had seen better decades. Her mother, Denise, had a boyfriend named Carl. Carl had been drinking since noon. Carl had friends over, and about 20 minutes ago, Carl and 2 of his buddies had started hitting Denise. Keisha had been in her bedroom. She heard the first crash, a lamp going over, then the yelling, then the sound every kid knows and no kid should, the specific heavy thud of a fist hitting a person who isn't fighting back. Keisha crawled out her window, dropped into the side yard, and ran. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew the man from the movies was at the strip mall today because her mom had mentioned it that morning, had said maybe they'd walk over and see him. And Keisha's 7-year-old brain did the math the only way a 7-year-old can. The man from the movies beats up bad guys. There are bad guys hurting my mom. I need the man from the movies. So she ran. Seagal stood up. His jaw tightened. He looked at Dwight. He looked at the 2 officers from the local precinct, a patrol sergeant named Hendricks and a younger officer named Tomlinson. Then he looked back at Keisha. "Show me where," he said. Now here's where this story splits from what you'd expect. In a movie, the hero walks over alone, kicks the door in, and handles business. Credits roll. But this was real life. Hendricks, the patrol sergeant, stepped in immediately. "Mr. Seagal, we'll handle this. Let us call it in and get a unit dispatched." Standard procedure, correct procedure. Hendricks was doing his job. Seagal didn't argue. He didn't give a speech. He just said, "Call it in while we walk." She said 3 blocks, and he took Keisha's hand and started moving. I swear this happened. The crowd at the event, maybe 30, 40 people, watched Steven Seagal walk east with a crying 7-year-old girl holding his hand, 2 cops jogging to catch up, and Dwight on his cell phone trying to figure out who to call. Nobody followed. But nobody looked away until they were out of sight. 3 blocks in that neighborhood isn't nothing. These weren't suburban blocks with green lawns and picket fences. These were Detroit blocks. Broken sidewalks, chain link fences, houses with plywood on the windows next to houses where somebody was still trying. Keisha walked fast, pulling Seagal's hand, and her beads clicked with every step. She hadn't stopped crying, but the crying had shifted. Less panic, more determination. She had an adult now. She had the adult. She was bringing him to fix it. They turned the corner onto Keisha's street, and Seagal could hear it before he could see it. A woman screaming. Not words, just sound. The kind of sound a person makes when they've moved past language and they're just trying to survive. Seagal's stride changed. Longer, faster. Not running, but covering ground with purpose. Hendricks unclipped his radio and called in a domestic disturbance with the address Keisha pointed to. A brick duplex with a sagging porch and a front door that was wide open. Music was coming from inside. Loud. Some kind of bass-heavy track that was half drowning out the screaming. But only half. Get this. Seagal stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He didn't charge in. He turned to Keisha, knelt down again, and said, "You stay right here with this officer. Don't come inside." He looked at Tomlinson, the younger cop. "Keep her here." Tomlinson nodded and put a hand on Keisha's shoulder. Then Seagal went up those steps with Hendricks right behind him. Here's what they walked into. The living room was wrecked. A coffee table was flipped. A lamp was in pieces on the floor, the shade bent sideways. There were beer cans everywhere, and the TV was playing some football game with the sound off because the stereo was doing all the audio work. And in the middle of that room, Denise was on the ground. She was curled up, arms around her head, and a man, Carl, was standing over her. He was big, not tall big, but thick big. Barrel chest, heavy arms, the kind of gut that still has muscle underneath it. He had a can of Budweiser in one hand, and the other hand was balled into a fist, and there was blood on his knuckles. 2 of his buddies were on the couch. One of them was just sitting there, watching. The other one had his foot up on Denise's back, pressing her down, casual, keeping her in place with his shoe while Carl did the work. Let me tell you something about Steven Seagal in 1990. The man was 6'4", 240, and he moved through doorways the way a truck moves through a tunnel. The space got smaller when he entered it. When he walked into that living room, the music didn't stop, the TV didn't click off, and nobody made a dramatic speech. What happened was simpler. Carl looked up. The 2 guys on the couch looked up. And for about 2 full seconds, nobody moved, because their brains were trying to reconcile what their eyes were showing them. Steven Seagal, the guy from the movie posters, the guy whose face was on billboards on the highway, was standing in their living room. Carl spoke first. "The hell are you doing in my house?" Seagal didn't answer him. He looked at Denise on the floor. He looked at the blood on her face, a cut above her left eye, a swelling on her lip that was already going purple. He looked at the boot on her back. Then he looked at the guy attached to the boot. "Take your foot off her." 4 words. Flat. No inflection. No threat underneath, or rather no threat that needed to be stated because the whole sentence was the threat. The guy on the couch pulled his foot back. Not fast, not slow, just pulled it back. He wasn't processing fast enough to be scared yet, but something in his body understood before his brain did. Hendricks had his badge out. Detroit PD. Nobody moves. Everyone stays calm. He was doing it by the book, identifying himself, establishing authority, trying to de-escalate. And in a perfect world, that would have been enough. Everyone would have put their hands up, Denise would have been walked out, a unit would have arrived, cuffs go on, report gets filed, system does its job. But Carl wasn't interested in a perfect world. "This is my house," Carl said. He took a step toward Hendricks. "You ain't got a warrant. Get out of my house." Hendricks held his ground. "Sir, we have a report of domestic violence. We're not leaving without talking to this woman. She's my girl. What happens in my house is my business. Now listen to me." Seagal had already moved. While Carl was focused on Hendricks, Seagal had stepped around the edge of the room and was standing between the couch and Denise. He reached down and helped her up, gently, one hand under her arm, one hand on her back. Denise was shaking so hard her teeth were clicking. She had a bruise forming on her forearm where somebody had grabbed her, and her shirt was torn at the collar. Seagal moved her behind him, toward the hallway, toward the door. He didn't say a word, he just repositioned. Carl saw it. Carl didn't like it. "Hey, I'm talking here." Carl dropped his beer can and stepped toward Seagal. "She ain't going nowhere." "I kid you not." Seagal turned around and faced Carl, and what happened next took less time than it takes to blink. Carl reached out with his right hand, maybe to grab Seagal's arm, maybe to shove him, we'll never know his full intention, and Seagal's hands moved. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't a kick. It was an Aikido technique, clean and practiced, the kind of thing Seagal had done 10,000 times on the mat and never once on camera with this kind of purpose. He redirected Carl's arm, twisted at the wrist, and took Carl from standing upright to face down on the floor in one continuous motion. Carl's cheek hit the carpet, and Seagal's knee was on his back, and Carl was making a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a yelp because his wrist was being held at an angle that human wrists do not enjoy. Real talk, the two guys on the couch both stood up. That was the moment. That was the fork in the road, because standing up could mean I'm surrendering or it could mean I'm jumping in. And for a half second, the room balanced on a razor's edge. The first guy, the one who'd had his foot on Denise, took a step toward Seagal. Bad move. Hendricks drew his service weapon and pointed it at the floor, not at the man, but the message was clear. Sit down. Now, the guy sat down. His buddy sat down a half second later. Neither one of them moved again. Seagal held Carl on the floor. He didn't twist harder, he didn't slam his head, he just held the position. Complete control, no damage beyond what had already been done. Carl was breathing hard, cursing into the carpet, but he couldn't move, not an inch. And here's the part that people who were there always mention when they tell this story. Seagal wasn't sweating. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't amped up. The whole thing had been so fast and so technical that his heart rate probably never spiked. Hendricks radioed for backup. Tomlinson was still outside with Keisha. Denise was in the hallway, crying but standing, holding onto the wall with both hands. And Carl was on the floor, held in place by a man who could have hurt him badly and was choosing not to. 2 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. Then another one. Officers came through the front door and took over. They cuffed Carl. They cuffed his two buddies, who were cooperative in that sudden, eager way people get cooperative when they realize they're going to jail and they want the record to show they didn't resist. Denise was taken to the porch, where a female officer sat with her and started documenting injuries. And that's when the moment happened, the one that made this story a legend instead of just a thing that went down. Seagal walked out onto the porch. Keisha was standing at the bottom of the steps, Tomlinson beside her, and when she saw her mama sitting there with a blanket around her shoulders and an officer beside her, she made a sound, not a word, just a sound, a high, desperate, relieved sound. And she ran up those steps and threw herself into Denise's arms. Denise caught her, pulled her in, and held on, and both of them rocked back and forth, and Denise said, "I'm okay, baby. Mama's okay. Mama's okay." Seagal stood at the edge of the porch and watched that. And here's what nobody tells you about Steven Seagal. The man who had just put a 250-pound abuser on the ground without breaking a sweat had tears in his eyes. He wiped them with the back of his hand, quick, the way men do when they don't want anyone to see. But Hendricks saw it. Tomlinson saw it. Dwight, who'd finally caught up and was standing on the sidewalk, saw it. Seagal stepped down the porch stairs. He walked over to where Keisha was still holding on to her mother, and he bent down next to them. He didn't say much. He said, "You're brave. You know that? You're the bravest person I met today." He was talking to Keisha, but he was looking at Denise, and the look said everything his mouth didn't. It said, "You don't deserve this. Nobody does." Then he stood up, and he turned to Dwight, and his voice was different now. Harder. Not angry, but resolved. "I want a number for a shelter," he said. "Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. And I want to make sure she gets there. Dwight made calls. Within an hour, Denise and Keisha were in a car heading to a women's shelter on the west side. Seagal paid for it. Not the shelter itself, it was publicly funded, but the transportation, the emergency supplies, a bag of clothes from a nearby store because Denise didn't want to go back in that house, and frankly, nobody was going to make her. He paid for all of it. He also gave Denise a phone number, not his personal line, but a number for a legal aid organization that he'd supported before. You call that number Monday morning, he told her. They'll help you with everything. Restraining order, custody, housing, everything. Denise took the number. Her hands were still shaking, but her grip was firm. She looked at Seagal and she said, "Why'd you come? You didn't have to come." And Seagal said something that has lived in this story ever since. He said, quiet and steady, barely above speaking volume, "She asked me to." 7 words. That was it. No speech, no sermon. She asked me to. A 7-year-old girl ran across a parking lot and grabbed his jacket and asked for help, and he went. That's the whole thing, that's the whole story at its core. But it isn't the end. Carl got booked. Assault, domestic battery, couple of other charges. His 2 buddies got lesser charges for their involvement. Now, here's what you need to understand about Carl. This wasn't his first time. Denise had called the police before. Twice. Both times Carl had talked his way out of it, or Denise had recanted under pressure, or the system had just ground too slowly and the case fell apart. Carl believed, and he'd said this to Denise, to his friends, to anyone who'd listen, that what happened in his house was his business, that no one was going to tell him how to handle his woman. He'd said it when the police came the first time. He'd said it to Hendricks that afternoon. He would not get the chance to say it a third time, because this time there was a witness whose name carried weight. When Steven Seagal agreed to provide a statement, the DA's office actually moved. Cases that might have shuffled to the bottom of a pile got picked up and read. Carl took a plea. He did time. Not enough time, it's never enough time, but he did time, and the restraining order that followed was ironclad, and Denise never went back. And that, right there, is the turning point. Not the wrist lock, not the takedown. The turning point was Steven Seagal standing in a police station the following Monday, giving a full written statement, making sure his name was attached, making sure nobody in that system could conveniently lose the paperwork. Because a celebrity walking into a house and stopping a beating makes for a great story. A celebrity following up, showing up at the station, throwing his weight behind a case that the system wanted to let disappear, that's the part that actually changed something. Here's the truth of it. The system doesn't work the same for everybody. A woman in a brick duplex on Detroit's east side calling about her boyfriend doesn't get the same response as a woman in Grosse Pointe calling about a stranger. That's not cynicism. That's math. But when a nationally famous movie star says, "I was there, I saw it, and I'm not going away," the math changes. The case file doesn't collect dust. The arraignment doesn't get pushed back 6 times. The plea deal doesn't let the guy walk with a fine and a handshake. Seagal's presence in that story was gravitational. It pulled everything toward a result. Word got around the neighborhood fast. By Sunday morning, everybody on that block knew what had happened. The details shifted in the telling, the way they always do. In some versions, Seagal threw Carl through a wall. In some versions, he fought all 3 guys at once. In one version that made Dwight laugh when he heard it, Seagal had apparently used a roundhouse kick, which is funny if you know anything about Aikido because that's not even remotely in the repertoire. But the core of the story stayed true. A little girl asked for help. A man answered, and a woman got out. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, this is a nice story, but Seagal is a controversial guy. He's had lawsuits. He's had accusations. His career has had ups and downs and sideways turns that make your head spin. And you know what? All of that is true. No single day defines a person, and I'm not here to canonize anybody. But I am here to tell you that on one particular Saturday in Detroit, Steven Seagal did something that mattered. He did it fast, he did it without cameras rolling, and he followed through. Whatever else is on his ledger, that Saturday is on there too. Months later, Dwight ran into Denise at a grocery store. She'd moved. New apartment, west side, nowhere near Carl. Keisha was in a new school. Denise had a job, nothing glamorous, stocking shelves at a Rite Aid, but it was hers, and the paycheck was hers, and nobody was taking it from her. She told Dwight she still had the phone number Seagal gave her, folded up in her wallet. She'd called it that Monday. just like he told her to. The legal aid people had walked her through everything: restraining order, emergency custody filing, victims' assistance funds. She said that phone call was the first time in 3 years she felt like a person instead of a problem. And Keisha? Let me tell you about Keisha. This part came out years later when Dwight shared it in a local newspaper interview. Keisha grew up, she graduated high school, she went to community college, and she went into social work, child protective services specifically. She became the person who shows up at the house, the person who takes the call, the person who reaches down and helps somebody stand up. Dwight asked her once if that day had anything to do with her career choice. Keisha said something that cracked Dwight's whole face open into a grin. She said, "I learned that if you run fast enough and ask loud enough, somebody will come." Mark my words, that sentence is the whole lesson. Not just for this story. For everything. If you run fast enough and ask loud enough, somebody will come. It's not guaranteed. The world doesn't always work that way. But on the days it does, it's because somebody decided to be the person who comes. If this story got to you, if it made your chest tighten even a little, hit that subscribe button right now. I'm telling stories like this every week. Real ones, true ones, the ones that deserve to be heard. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and I'll keep bringing them. Back to that Saturday. By late afternoon, the event at the strip mall was over. Most of the crowd had gone home. Seagal came back to the parking lot and sat on the hood of that same Suburban. Hendricks came over, still in uniform, still on duty, and he stood there for a minute, not saying anything. Then he said, "I've been on the force 12 years. I've responded to 100 domestic calls, maybe more. Most of the time we show up, we write a report, and we leave. And nothing changes." He paused. "Today something changed." Seagal nodded. He didn't say anything big. He didn't deliver a monologue. He sat there on the hood of that truck in a strip mall parking lot in Detroit, and he looked tired. Not physically tired, something deeper. The kind of tired you get when you see how broken things are, and you know that what you did today was a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. But it was the right Band-Aid, and the wound was a little less open because of it. Dwight drove him back to his hotel. In the car, Seagal was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That little girl ran 3 blocks. By herself, 7 years old." He shook his head. She didn't wait for someone to save her. She went and got help. That's not something you can teach. Dwight agreed. They didn't talk much after that. Some moments don't need more words. The story lived on the way neighborhood stories do, told at barbershops, at kitchen tables, at bus stops when somebody recognized the block and said, "Oh, you know what happened there, right?" It never made national news. There were no press conferences, no Entertainment Tonight segments, no magazine covers. It was a local story, and it stayed local. And honestly, that might be why it stayed true. The stories that get picked up by media get polished and packaged and trimmed into something clean. The stories that stay in the neighborhood keep their rough edges. They keep the beer cans on the floor and the blood on the knuckles and the sound a little girl makes when she sees her mama sitting up instead of lying down. This is what I'll leave you with. There's a version of this story where Steven Seagal wasn't at that strip mall, where the community event was somewhere else, or he'd canceled, or he'd left early. In that version, Keisha runs across a parking lot and finds nobody. She stands there, out of breath, beads clicking, tears on her face, and there's no one to grab onto. In that version, she runs back home, or she finds a neighbor, or maybe she doesn't find anyone, and her mother takes another beating, and another one after that, until the story ends the way too many of these stories end, with a funeral or a disappearance or a kid in the system and a woman who stopped believing anyone would come. But that's not the version that happened. The version that happened is the one where a man was standing in a parking lot and a child grabbed his jacket and he went. Cross my heart, the whole thing comes down to that. He went. No cameras, no stunt coordinators, no second takes. A 7-year-old girl said, "They're beating my mama," and a man took her hand and walked 3 blocks east into a situation he didn't have to walk into. And when it was done, when the handcuffs were on, and the ambulance had been called and the shelter had a room, he sat on the hood of a truck and looked tired. Because doing the right thing in real life doesn't come with a soundtrack. It doesn't come with applause. It comes with a bone-deep exhaustion and the quiet knowledge that tomorrow there'll be another house and another woman and another kid running, And you can't be at every strip mall in every city, but you were at this one. And you went. That's the legend. Not the wrist lock, not the takedown, not the movie star walking into a room and making bad guys freeze. The legend is simpler and bigger than that. The legend is a little girl who believed help existed and a man who proved her right. And Keisha grew up to be the help. She became the person at the other end of the phone, the one who comes when you run fast enough and ask loud enough. She took the thing that happened to her on the worst Saturday of her childhood and turned it into a career of showing up for other people's worst Saturdays. That's not a movie. That's better than a movie. Movies end when the credits roll. This one is still going. Steven Seagal walked into a house in Detroit with nothing but his hands and a patrol sergeant, and he changed the trajectory of 2 lives in under 5 minutes. Denise got out. Keisha grew up. Carl went away. And a neighborhood got a story worth keeping. You want to know what legends really are? They're not the loudest moments. They're the ones that keep mattering after everyone stops talking. Decades later, on a block in Detroit, if you mention that Saturday, somebody will nod. Somebody will say, yeah, I remember that. And the story will get told again, rough edges and all. And it will still be true. A little girl ran 3 blocks, grabbed a stranger's jacket and said, please. And the stranger went. That's the legend, and it's enough